The Cinnamon Tart Conundrum, a Miss Marple Mystery. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like silk ribbons in the moonlight. I'm Connor, your guide through the shadows and secrets that dance just beneath the surface of ordinary life. Tonight we find ourselves in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, where even the sweetest of competitions can turn bitter, and where our beloved Miss Jane Marple will once again prove that truth, like a perfectly baked tart, requires just the right ingredients and careful attention to detail. So settle in with your evening tea, draw the curtains against the world outside, and let us begin this tale of rivalry, revenge, and the deadly art of baking. Chapter 1. The Golden Whisk Gleams. The morning of the St. Mary Mead annual baking contest dawned with the sort of crisp October clarity that made every cottage garden sparkle like a jeweled brooch. Miss Jane Marple, carefully pinning her best hat in place before her bedroom mirror, observed through her window the unusual bustle of activity surrounding the village hall. Even at 7:30, determined contestants were already arriving with their carefully covered entries, their faces bearing that particular mixture of nervous excitement and grim determination that competitive baking invariably inspired. "Florence," she called to her faithful maid, who was laying out her second-best coat, "I do believe this year's contest promises to be most interesting. Mrs. Weatherby has been practicing her Victoria sponge for weeks, and young Sarah Mills has been quite secretive about her entry." Florence nodded knowingly as she helped Miss Marple into her coat. "That Sarah's been buying ingredients from 3 different shops, miss. Most peculiar, if you ask me. And Mrs. Dalton's been asking questions about everyone else's recipes. Not very sporting, I'd say." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. In her long experience of village life, she had observed that competitions of any sort had a remarkable way of revealing the true nature of otherwise civilized people. The annual baking contest, now in its 15th year, had become something of a battlefield where old grudges were settled through the medium of flour, butter, and sugar. The village hall buzzed with activity when Miss Marple arrived at 9 o'clock. Long tables had been arranged in neat rows, each draped with pristine white cloths and adorned with small numbered cards. The air was thick with the competing aromas of vanilla, cinnamon, lemon zest, and chocolate, a symphony of scents that would have been delightful under normal circumstances, but somehow felt almost overwhelming in the charged atmosphere of competition. Mrs. Celia Harrington, the contest organizer and self-appointed guardian of village traditions, swept between the tables with military precision, her steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her clipboard clutched like a weapon. She had organized this contest since its inception and took her responsibilities with the seriousness of a general preparing for battle. "Entries must be placed on the designated tables by 10:30 sharp," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Judging begins promptly at 11, and absolutely no one is permitted near the entries once judging has commenced." Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea table, which commanded an excellent view of the proceedings while maintaining the appearance of casual observance. From this vantage point she could observe the intricate social dynamics that played out with each carefully placed cake stand and decoratively arranged tart. Mrs. Eleanor Weatherby, a plump woman in her 60s with nervous, fluttering hands, fussed over her Victoria sponge with the anxiety of a mother sending her child off to school. She had won the contest 3 years running, an achievement that had made her something of a local celebrity, but had also painted a target on her back for ambitious competitors. "Oh dear," Mrs. Weatherby murmured to herself, adjusting the doily beneath her cake for the 5th time. "I do hope the cream hasn't begun to separate. The weather is rather warm for October, isn't it?" At the next table, Sarah Mills, a young woman of perhaps 25 with determined dark eyes and flour still dusting her apron, was arranging what appeared to be individual cinnamon tarts with meticulous care. Each tart was a perfect golden brown, its surface glossy with what looked like a honey glaze, and the smell of cinnamon and warm spice was almost intoxicating. Miss Marple noticed how Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she positioned each tart, and how her eyes kept darting toward Mrs. Weatherby's table with an expression that seemed to combine admiration with something considerably less charitable. "They look absolutely divine, my dear," said Mrs. Dalton, appearing suddenly at Sarah's elbow with the sort of false brightness that often masked genuine malice. Margaret Dalton was a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who had moved to St. Mary Mead only 2 years ago, but had already established herself as the village's most accomplished gossip and social climber. "The secret," Sarah replied with carefully controlled politeness, "is in getting the spice mixture just right. Too much cinnamon can overpower the pastry, but too little leaves them bland." "How fascinating," Mrs. Dalton cooed, leaning in for a closer look. "And what a lovely tin you've brought them in. Is it an antique?" Miss Marple's attention sharpened as she observed this exchange. Sarah's jaw had tightened at the mention of the tin, and her response was notably cooler. "It belonged to my grandmother. She always said the right container was as important as the right recipe." The tin in question was indeed beautiful, an ornate Victorian biscuit tin decorated with painted roses and scrollwork, the sort of family heirloom that carried memories along with its practical function. But Miss Marple noticed something curious. There was another tin, nearly identical, sitting on Mrs. Weatherby's table, though partially hidden behind her cake stand. As the morning progressed, more entries appeared: Mrs. Jenkins's elaborate chocolate gâteau, Mr. Fulton's surprisingly sophisticated French pastries, and young Tommy Harrison's endearingly lopsided but enthusiastic attempt at scones. Each contributor carried with them their own hopes, anxieties, and barely concealed rivalries. At precisely 11 o'clock, Mrs. Harrington rang a small silver bell, and the judging commenced. The 3 judges, Professor Mordaunt, retired headmaster, and noted gourmand, Dr. Agnes Freely, whose medical background presumably qualified her to assess the healthfulness of various confections, and Mrs. Violet Ashby, a London transplant, who had once worked in a prestigious bakery, took their positions with ceremonial gravity. Miss Marple watched with growing interest as the judges moved methodically from table to table, making notes, sampling delicate forkfuls, and engaging in whispered consultations. The atmosphere in the hall had grown thick with tension, as if the very air was holding its breath. It was when Professor Mordaunt reached Sarah Mill's table that Miss Marple noticed the first sign of trouble. The elderly professor, a man known for his refined palate and appreciation of fine food, paused after his first bite of the cinnamon tart, his expression shifting from pleasant anticipation to puzzlement, then to something approaching alarm. "I say," he began, his voice suddenly strained, "these are rather—" He never finished the sentence. His face had gone an alarming shade of red, his breath coming in harsh, labored gasps. Within moments he was clutching at his throat, his eyes wide with terror as his airways began to close. The hall erupted into chaos as Professor Mordaunt collapsed, his body convulsing as he fought for breath that would not come. Dr. Freely rushed forward, her medical training taking precedence over her judging duties, but even Miss Marple could see from across the room that it was already too late. By the time the ambulance arrived, Professor Mordaunt was dead, and the St. Mary Mead annual baking contest had become the scene of what appeared to be a tragic accident, or something far more sinister. Chapter 2: A Bitter Taste of Truth. The aftermath of Professor Mordaunt's collapse had transformed the cheerful village hall into something resembling a crime scene. Police tape cordoned off the judge's table, and Inspector Craddock, a capable man in his 40s who had learned to value Miss Marple's insights from previous encounters, was methodically photographing the evidence while Dr. Freely provided her professional assessment of what had occurred. "Anaphylactic shock," she explained to the inspector, her voice still shaken by the tragedy she had witnessed. The poor man's airways closed completely. It was over within minutes, possibly less. "I've seen it before, though rarely so severe or so rapid." Miss Marple, who had remained quietly in the background during the initial emergency response, now approached with the diffident manner that often preceded her most penetrating observations. "Dr. Freely, forgive my intrusion, but did Professor Mordaunt suffer from any known allergies?" "In my experience, such violent reactions don't occur without warning." Dr. Freely nodded grimly. "Severe nut allergy, particularly to almonds and walnuts. He'd been dealing with it for years, always carried an emergency injector, but he was usually so careful about what he ate, always asked about ingredients." Inspector Craddock looked up from his photographs. "Miss Marple, I assume you observed the entire proceedings this morning. Did you notice anything unusual about Professor Mordaunt's behavior before he sampled the tart? He seemed perfectly normal, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, her keen eyes surveying the table where Sarah Mill's cinnamon tarts still sat, now under police protection, cheerful, even. He was clearly enjoying his role as judge, and had made several complimentary remarks about the various entries. It was only when he tasted the cinnamon tart that his demeanor changed. Sarah Mills, who had been sitting in stunned silence since the tragedy, suddenly looked up with wild eyes. "But there are no nuts in my recipe," she protested, her voice cracking with emotion. "I followed my grandmother's instructions exactly: flour, butter, cinnamon, sugar, eggs, vanilla, nothing else. I would never put nuts in a cinnamon tart." Inspector Craddock made a note of this declaration, while Dr. Freely continued her examination of the remaining tarts. "These certainly don't appear to contain visible nuts," she observed, breaking one open to examine its interior. Though of course ground nuts or nut oils could be present without being immediately obvious. Mrs. Harrington, who had been hovering nearby with the protective instincts of someone whose carefully organized event had been ruined, stepped forward with evident distress. "This is absolutely unprecedented," she declared. "In 15 years of organizing this contest, we've never had so much as a case of indigestion, let alone this." Miss Marple moved closer to examine the display table, her experienced eye taking in details that others might overlook. The cinnamon tarts were indeed beautiful, perfectly uniform in size and color, with an appealing rustic charm that spoke of skilled home baking rather than professional perfection. But something about the arrangement troubled her, though she couldn't immediately identify what it was. "Sarah, my dear," she said gently, "might I ask about your grandmother's recipe? You mentioned following her instructions exactly. Was this a family tradition, making these particular tarts?" Sarah's face crumpled at the question. "She died last year," she whispered. "Grandmother Emma. She raised me after my parents died when I was 12. This recipe was her specialty. She used to make these tarts for every village occasion, church fetes, harvest festivals, Christmas gatherings. Everyone loved them." "How lovely that you're carrying on her tradition," Miss Marple said warmly, though her mind was working rapidly through the implications of what she'd just learned. "And the tin you brought them in, that was hers as well." "Yes, it's been in our family for generations. Grandmother always said the tarts should be stored in their proper tin to keep them fresh." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke of her grandmother, but there was an underlying current of something Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. Grief, certainly, but perhaps something more complex. Inspector Craddock had finished his preliminary examination and was beginning to interview the other contestants. Mrs. Weatherby was in tears, convinced that her presence as the defending champion had somehow contributed to the tragedy. Mrs. Dalton meanwhile seemed almost excited by the drama, offering theories and observations with unseemly enthusiasm. "Of course one hears of such things," Mrs. Dalton was saying to anyone who would listen. "Food poisoning at village events, though usually it's the mayonnaise that goes off, not mysterious nut allergies. Though I must say, I did notice Sarah being rather secretive about her ingredients, very protective of her methods, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple filed this observation away while continuing her own discreet investigation. She had noticed that Mrs. Weatherby's table also held a decorative tin, similar in style to Sarah's but with subtle differences in the painted design. When she mentioned this to Mrs. Weatherby, the older woman looked confused. "Oh, that old thing," Mrs. Weatherby said dismissively. "I brought it to hold my extra cake decorations, though I hardly used it in the end. It belonged to my late mother-in-law. She was quite the baker in her day, though not particularly fond of sharing her recipes." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, studying the tin more closely. Like Sarah's, it was Victorian in design, decorated with painted roses, but the workmanship was slightly different, and there were small differences in the color palette that suggested they were not from the same set, despite their obvious similarities. Dr. Freely approached with the results of her more detailed examination of the tarts. "Inspector, I've found what appears to be finely ground almonds distributed throughout the filling, not in the pastry itself, but definitely in the cinnamon mixture." It's been very cleverly incorporated. Someone with extensive knowledge of baking would have been required to achieve such even distribution without affecting the texture or appearance. Sarah Mills went pale at this announcement. That's impossible, she stammered. I made those tarts myself from start to finish. I know exactly what went into them. But Miss Marple was studying the young woman's face with the careful attention she usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. There was genuine shock there, certainly, but also a flicker of something else, a realization perhaps, or the dawning of a terrible suspicion. Sarah, Miss Marple said quietly, drawing the girl aside, when you prepared the tarts yesterday evening, did you leave them unattended at any point, even briefly? Sarah's eyes widened as the implication of the question sank in. Yes, actually. I had them cooling on the kitchen table while I cleaned up, and Mrs. Dalton stopped by to borrow some sugar. She said she was making a last-minute entry herself, though I noticed she didn't bring anything to the contest after all. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind, though several crucial elements remained unclear. As she watched Inspector Craddock continue his methodical investigation, she reflected that this case, like so many others, would likely reveal layers of human motivation that went far deeper than a simple accident or even a moment of malicious impulse. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere in the complex relationships between the women of St. Mary Mead, in old grievances and new jealousies, and in the dangerous combination of opportunity and long-simmering resentment that could transform even the most innocent village tradition into an instrument of murder. Chapter 3: Secrets in the Sifted Flour. The police investigation continued through the afternoon, but Miss Marple found herself increasingly drawn to the human stories behind the tragedy. While Inspector Craddock focused on the technical aspects of how ground almonds had found their way into Sarah Mills's cinnamon tarts, Miss Marple was more interested in why someone would want Professor Mordaunt dead, or whether he had been the intended victim at all. She began her informal inquiry by visiting Mrs. Weatherby, who lived in a neat cottage surrounded by prize-winning roses and an impeccably maintained kitchen garden. The older woman received her graciously, though her hands still trembled as she served tea and biscuits in her front parlor. Such a dreadful thing to happen, Mrs. Weatherby said, settling into her favorite armchair with obvious distress. Poor Professor Mordaunt. He was always so encouraging about my baking, even when I had those disasters with the soufflé 2 years ago. And that poor child Sarah, she looks absolutely devastated. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. You've known Sarah since she came to live with her grandmother, haven't you? That must have been quite an adjustment for a young girl. Oh yes, she was only 12 when the tragedy happened. Car accident, both parents killed instantly. Emma Mills was getting on in years by then, but she took Sarah in without hesitation. Devoted grandmother, though perhaps a bit protective. Protective how? Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak ill of the dead. Well, Emma was very particular about Sarah's associations, didn't approve of the girl mixing with certain elements in the village. There was that unfortunate business with the Harrison boy, Tommy's older brother, you know. Emma was quite firm that Sarah should have nothing to do with him. Miss Marple filed this information away, though she wondered what connection it might have to the current tragedy. And Sarah's interest in baking, did that develop under her grandmother's influence? Oh, absolutely. Emma was legendary for her baking skills, though she could be rather secretive about her methods. Never shared recipes, always claimed her techniques were family secrets that shouldn't be spread about. Some people found it a bit off-putting, though her results were certainly impressive. After leaving Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple made her way to the village shop, which served as an unofficial information exchange, where news, gossip and speculation flowed as freely as the tea at the church social. Mrs. Pembridge, who had run the shop for 30 years, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs, and was usually happy to share her insights with interested parties. Terrible business up at the hall, Mrs. Pembridge said, shaking her grey head as she arranged a display of tinned goods. Though I must say, I'm not entirely surprised something like this happened eventually. There's been bad blood brewing in this village for months, maybe longer. Bad blood? Miss Marple inquired, examining a particularly fine display of locally made preserves. "Oh yes, mostly centered around that Margaret Dalton. She's been stirring up trouble since the day she arrived, asking pointed questions, making suggestions about how things might be done better. Some people don't appreciate outsiders coming in and criticizing established ways." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, recognizing the type of social dynamic that often developed in small communities when newcomers challenged existing hierarchies. "And then there's the matter of the cottage," Mrs. Pembridge continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Emma Mill's place, you know. There was quite a to-do about the will after she died. Margaret Dalton had apparently been told she could rent it, but then it turned out Emma had left it to Sarah outright. Margaret was not pleased, I can tell you that." This was news to Miss Marple, and potentially significant news at that. Property disputes had been the motive for murder in many cases throughout history, and the combination of disappointed expectations and public embarrassment could create powerful resentments. "I see," Miss Marple said carefully. "And how did Sarah react to inheriting the cottage?" "Poor girl was overwhelmed, I think. She'd been living there all those years as Emma's granddaughter, never expecting to own it. Margaret Dalton made several offers to buy it, quite generous ones too, but Sarah refused to sell, said she wanted to keep it as a memorial to her grandmother." Miss Marple left the village shop with her mind buzzing with new possibilities. The picture that was emerging suggested a complex web of relationships and grievances that extended far beyond simple baking competition rivalries. Margaret Dalton appeared to be at the center of several conflicts, which made her behavior on the morning of the contest even more suspicious. Her next stop was the cottage in question, a charming stone building with a well-tended garden and smoke rising invitingly from its chimney. Sarah Mills answered the door looking exhausted and frightened, her earlier composure having given way to the full realization of her situation. "Miss Marple," Sarah said, stepping aside to let her visitor enter, "I was hoping you might come by. Everyone else seems to think I'm some sort of murderer, but I know you have a reputation for seeing the truth in these matters." The cottage's interior was a testament to generations of careful housekeeping and thoughtful decorating. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and the kitchen still showed evidence of Emma Mill's legendary baking skills, professional quality mixing bowls, rows of spice jars arranged with military precision, and a collection of vintage cake tins that would have been the envy of any serious baker. "Sarah, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling into a worn but comfortable chair near the kitchen table, "I'd like you to tell me exactly what happened yesterday evening when you were preparing the tarts. Start from the beginning, and don't leave out any details, no matter how trivial they might seem." Sarah took a deep breath and began her account. She had started baking around 6 o'clock, following her grandmother's handwritten recipe exactly as she always did. The process had gone smoothly until she reached the point of preparing the cinnamon filling, when she discovered she was short of vanilla extract. "I was in the middle of mixing the filling when I realized I didn't have enough vanilla," Sarah explained. "I called Mrs. Dalton because I knew she did a lot of baking, and might have some to spare. She said she'd bring some over, and did she come immediately, within about 20 minutes. I had the tart shells cooling on the rack, and the filling prepared, but I hadn't put them together yet." Mrs. Dalton came into the kitchen. She always makes herself quite at home, and admired my work. She seemed particularly interested in grandmother's spice collection. Miss Marple felt a small chill of foreboding. "Did she handle any of your ingredients while she was here?" Sarah's face went pale as she considered the question. I'm not certain. I stepped out to get some money to pay her for the vanilla. She insisted I pay her back, said she wasn't running a charity, and when I returned she was standing near the spice rack. She said she was just admiring grandmother's organization. "And how long were you out of the kitchen?" "Only a few minutes, but long enough for—" Sarah's voice trailed off as the full implication of what might have occurred began to sink in. "You think she put ground almonds in my spices?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly, but her expression conveyed her suspicions clearly enough. "Sarah, I'd like you to show me your grandmother's spice collection, particularly the cinnamon. With trembling hands, Sarah led Miss Marple to a row of matching glass jars arranged along a wooden shelf. Each jar was meticulously labeled in Emma Mill's careful script, and the contents appeared fresh and properly stored. But when Sarah opened the jar labeled cinnamon, Ceylon, best quality, Miss Marple immediately noticed something unusual about its appearance. "This doesn't look quite right," Miss Marple observed, examining the reddish-brown powder closely. "The texture seems different from pure cinnamon. There are pale flecks mixed in that suggest the presence of ground nuts." Sarah stared at the jar in horror. "She tampered with grandmother's spices," she whispered. "Margaret Dalton contaminated my ingredients deliberately, but why? What did she hope to achieve?" Miss Marple was beginning to formulate a theory, though several crucial pieces of the puzzle remained unclear. "Sarah, I need to ask you something that might seem odd. Yesterday evening, after you had finished baking, did you leave the tarts here in the cottage, or did you take them somewhere else?" "I left them here overnight," Sarah replied. "They were cooling in their tin on the kitchen table when I went to bed. I planned to take them to the contest first thing in the morning. And this morning, when you collected them for the contest, did you check the contents of the tin before you left?" Sarah shook her head. "I just picked up the tin and took it to the hall. I trusted that everything was exactly as I'd left it." She paused, a new thought occurring to her. "But now that you mention it, the tin seemed heavier than I expected when I picked it up. I thought perhaps I'd made the tarts a bit larger than usual." Miss Marple nodded grimly. The picture that was emerging suggested a plan of considerable sophistication and malice, one that had required careful timing and intimate knowledge of both Sarah's routine and the contest procedures. But the ultimate target of this elaborate scheme remained unclear, and Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when it finally emerged, would reveal motives that went far deeper than simple neighborly rivalry. Chapter 4: The Weight of Deception. The morning following her visit to Sarah Mills, Miss Marple found herself in the unusual position of conducting what amounted to a parallel investigation alongside Inspector Craddock's official inquiry. While the inspector focused on the forensic evidence, analyzing the contaminated cinnamon, interviewing witnesses, and establishing timelines, Miss Marple pursued the more subtle threads of human motivation and village politics that she suspected lay at the heart of the case. Her first stop was Margaret Dalton's cottage, a modernized dwelling that stood out somewhat awkwardly among the more traditional village buildings. Mrs. Dalton had clearly spent considerable money on improvements since moving to St. Mary Mead, installing new windows, a pristine garden, and what appeared to be a state-of-the-art kitchen that would have been the envy of any serious baker. Margaret Dalton received Miss Marple with the sort of excessive cordiality that often masked deeper anxieties. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, with carefully styled blonde hair and expensive clothes that seemed slightly too formal for village life. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who had enjoyed considerable prosperity, but was perhaps not entirely secure in her current circumstances. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you, Mrs. Dalton gushed, ushering her guest into a sitting room decorated with what appeared to be genuine antiques and artwork of notable quality. "I do hope you're not here about that dreadful business at the contest. Such a terrible accident, though one does wonder about the wisdom of having judges with severe allergies." Miss Marple settled into the offered chair with her characteristic gentle smile. "Actually, Mrs. Dalton, I was rather hoping you might help me understand some aspects of the case that puzzle me. You visited Sarah Mills yesterday evening, I believe?" A flicker of wariness crossed Mrs. Dalton's features before she regained her composure. "Oh yes, the poor dear needed some vanilla extract. I was happy to help, of course. It's what neighbors do, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," Miss Marple agreed. "And you mentioned that you were planning your own entry for the contest. I noticed you didn't bring anything on the day." Mrs. Dalton waved a dismissive hand. "Last-minute disaster, I'm afraid. My oven has been playing up terribly. The temperature control is completely unreliable. I spent hours on a chocolate soufflé only to have it collapse completely. Most frustrating." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she made a mental note to investigate this claimed oven problem. In her experience, alibis that relied on mechanical failures often proved to be conveniently constructed after the fact. "How disappointing for you," she said. "Though I must say, Your kitchen looks beautifully equipped. I noticed it yesterday when I walked past, such modern appliances. Oh, you saw the kitchen? Mrs. Dalton seemed momentarily flustered. Yes, well, I do believe in having proper tools for any job. Baking requires precision, doesn't it? The right temperature, the right timing, the right ingredients. There was something in the way she emphasized right ingredients that caught Miss Marple's attention. The comment seemed to carry a weight of meaning beyond its literal sense, as if Mrs. Dalton was making some sort of point that she expected her visitor to understand. Quite so, Miss Marple replied calmly. I understand you were particularly interested in Emma Mill's spice collection when you visited Sarah yesterday evening. This time Mrs. Dalton's reaction was unmistakable, a quick tightening around her eyes and a momentary hesitation before she responded. Emma certainly kept her kitchen well organized. I admired her system, though I did think some of her spices looked rather old. Cinnamon loses its potency over time, you know. Miss Marple filed this comment away as potentially significant. If Mrs. Dalton had indeed tampered with Sarah's cinnamon, she was now providing what might be interpreted as a justification for her actions, helping to refresh old spices with new ingredients. After leaving Mrs. Dalton's cottage, Miss Marple made her way to the village doctor's surgery, where she hoped to learn more about Professor Mordaunt's medical history and the specific nature of his allergic reactions. Dr. Haydock, a sensible man who had long since learned to respect Miss Marple's insights, was happy to share what information he could within the bounds of professional discretion. Severe allergy to tree nuts, particularly almonds, Dr. Haydock confirmed. He'd been dealing with it for at least 20 years, ever since a reaction to a marzipan cake nearly killed him. Very careful about checking ingredients, always carried emergency medication. The fact that he consumed something containing almonds suggests either carelessness on his part, which would be completely out of character, or deliberate deception on someone else's. Had he mentioned any concerns about the contest? Miss Marple asked. Any worries about food safety or particular contestants? Dr. Haydock shook his head. On the contrary, he was quite looking forward to it. Said it was one of the highlights of his year, sampling all the village's finest baking. He did mention that this year seemed particularly competitive. Apparently there had been some sort of controversy about one of the contestants. This was the first Miss Marple had heard of any pre-existing controversy, and she pressed for details. Dr. Haydock explained that Professor Mordaunt had heard rumors about disputes over recipes, suggestions that some contestants were not being entirely honest about the originality of their entries. He didn't name names, Dr. Haydock continued, but he did say he hoped the contest would focus on skill and creativity rather than settling old scores. Made me wonder if there were politics involved that I wasn't aware of. Miss Marple left the surgery with a growing sense that the poisoning of Professor Mordaunt might have been intended to prevent him from discovering or revealing something about the contest entries. Perhaps the ground almonds in Sarah's cinnamon had been meant to cause a mild reaction that would disrupt the judging, allowing some other deception to go unnoticed. Her next stop was the village hall, where the aftermath of the previous day's tragedy was still evident. The police had removed most of the evidence, but the building retained an atmosphere of disrupted normalcy that made Miss Marple's skin prickle with unease. Mrs. Harrington was there, attempting to restore order to the space and clearly struggling with the implications of what had occurred during her carefully organized event. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her face showing the strain of the past 24 hours. Miss Marple, I'm so glad you're here, Mrs. Harrington said, setting down a stack of chairs she had been arranging. I've been going over everything in my mind, trying to understand how such a thing could have happened. In 15 years we've never had so much as a dispute over judging, let alone a death. These things happen even in the most carefully organized events, Miss Marple said soothingly. Though I'm curious about the judging process itself. Did the judges sample all the entries, or did they focus on particular ones? Mrs. Harrington consulted her clipboard, which she had clearly been using to reconstruct the events of the previous morning. They were quite systematic actually, started at one end of the room and worked their way through methodically. Professor Mordaunt was most conscientious. He sampled everything, made detailed notes, asked questions about ingredients and techniques. And had he made any comments about the entries before he reached Sarah's tarts? Oh yes, he was quite complimentary about most of them. Particularly impressed with Mrs. Weatherby's Victoria sponge, said the texture was perfect. He also made some remarks about authenticity, how important it was for contestants to be honest about their sources and methods. Miss Marple felt a small chill at this information. If Professor Mordaunt had been making pointed comments about authenticity and honesty, it suggested he might have suspected that something was amiss with one or more of the entries. Perhaps his death had been intended to prevent him from voicing those suspicions publicly. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of motivations and opportunities that seemed to surround the case. Margaret Dalton clearly had both motive and opportunity to tamper with Sarah's ingredients, but the ultimate purpose of such tampering remained unclear. If the goal had been simply to eliminate Sarah from the competition, surely a less drastic method could have been employed. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, lay in understanding not just what had happened, but what had been intended to happen, and why someone had been willing to risk murder to achieve their goals. The answer, she felt certain, would reveal depths of malice and calculation that went far beyond simple contest rivalry. Chapter 5. Tins, Tales, and Treachery. Miss Marple spent the following morning in her garden, ostensibly tending to her late-blooming chrysanthemums, but actually allowing her mind to work through the various puzzling elements of the case. It was during this period of contemplation that she began to focus on what she had come to think of as the tin mystery, the curious similarity between Sarah Mills's antique biscuit tin and the one that had appeared on Mrs. Weatherby's table. After lunch, she paid a visit to Mrs. Weatherby, finding the older woman in her kitchen attempting to restore some normalcy to her routine by preparing bread for the church social. Mrs. Weatherby's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she kneaded the dough, but Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders and the worried crease between her brows. "I keep thinking about poor Professor Mordaunt," Mrs. Weatherby said without preamble as she invited Miss Marple to sit at her kitchen table. Such a kind man, and so knowledgeable about baking. He always had encouraging words for everyone, even when their efforts were less than perfect. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and settled herself comfortably. "Mrs. Weatherby, I've been puzzling over something rather odd. That decorative tin you brought to the contest, you mentioned it belonged to your late mother-in-law. Might I ask how long you've had it?" Mrs. Weatherby paused in her kneading, a look of confusion crossing her features. "That's the strangest thing, Miss Marple. I could have sworn I'd packed my usual cake carrier that morning, but when I arrived at the hall, I found that tin instead. I assumed I'd grabbed it by mistake in my nervousness, though I couldn't remember putting it in my car." This was precisely the sort of detail that set Miss Marple's investigative instincts humming. "And you're certain it was your mother-in-law's tin?" "Well, I thought so at the time, but now that you mention it." Mrs. Weatherby wiped her hands on her apron and moved to a cabinet near the window. "Here's Mother Weatherby's tin collection. I kept them after she passed, though I rarely use them anymore." She opened the cabinet to reveal a collection of vintage tins, including one that was nearly identical to the tin Miss Marple remembered seeing at the contest. Nearly identical, but with subtle differences in the painted roses and the arrangement of the decorative scrollwork. "How very curious," Miss Marple murmured, examining the genuine tin closely. "This one is quite beautiful, but definitely not the same as the one you had at the contest. The rose pattern is different, and the coloring is more muted." Mrs. Weatherby looked genuinely bewildered. "But if this is Mother Weatherby's tin, then whose tin did I have at the contest? And how did it end up in my car?" Miss Marple was beginning to formulate a theory that would explain not only the mysterious tin exchange, but several other puzzling aspects of the case. "Mrs. Weatherby, on the morning of the contest, did you stop anywhere before arriving at the hall, perhaps to pick up last-minute supplies or to visit with anyone?" "Actually, yes. I stopped at Sarah Mills's cottage to wish her good luck. She seemed so nervous about her first real competition, and I wanted to encourage her. We chatted briefly in her kitchen while she was packing her tarts." "And did you leave anything in her kitchen, your coat perhaps or a bag?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened as she recalled the morning's events. "I set my cake carrier down on her kitchen table while we talked. She was arranging her tarts in that beautiful antique tin of her grandmother's.
We admired each other's containers. Hers was so much more elegant than my plain carrier. Miss Marple felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing puzzle pieces click into place, and when you left Sarah's cottage, you picked up what you thought was your carrier, but in the dim morning light and in your pre-contest nervousness, you accidentally took the wrong container. But that would mean Mrs. Weatherby's face went pale as the implication struck her. That would mean Sarah's tarts weren't in her grandmother's tin at all, they were in my plain carrier. But then whose tarts were in the beautiful tin that I took to the contest? This was exactly the question Miss Marple had been hoping to explore. If Sarah's tarts had been switched with someone else's, it would explain not only how ground almonds had found their way into the cinnamon mixture, but also why the contamination had been so evenly distributed and professionally incorporated. Her next stop was Sarah Mills's cottage, where she found the young woman in a state of considerable agitation. Sarah had clearly been crying, and her usually neat appearance was disheveled with anxiety and sleepless worry. "Miss Marple, thank goodness you've come," Sarah said, ushering her visitor into the kitchen. "Inspector Craddock was here again this morning, asking more questions about my movements yesterday evening. I don't think he believes my story about Mrs. Dalton tampering with the cinnamon." Miss Marple settled into the same chair she had occupied during her previous visit, her eyes taking in the kitchen's familiar details with renewed interest. "Sarah, I need you to think very carefully about yesterday morning when you were preparing to leave for the contest. You packed your tarts in your grandmother's tin, didn't you?" "Yes, just as I always do for special occasions. Grandmother always said her tarts should travel in their proper tin." "And Mrs. Weatherby visited you that morning?" Sarah nodded. "She was so kind, coming by to wish me luck. She admired the tin, said it was much more elegant than her plain cake carrier. We chatted for a few minutes while I finished packing, and after she left, did you check the contents of your tin before taking it to the hall?" Sarah shook her head. "I was running a bit late by then, and I just grabbed the tin and rushed out. It seemed heavier than usual, but I thought perhaps I'd made the tarts a bit larger than normal." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, I believe you may have taken the wrong tin to the contest. I think you accidentally picked up Mrs. Weatherby's cake carrier, while she took your grandmother's tin containing someone else's tarts." The color drained from Sarah's face as she processed this possibility. "But that would mean the tarts that killed Professor Mordaunt weren't mine at all. They were made by someone else, someone who deliberately contaminated them with ground almonds." "Precisely," Miss Marple said gently, "and I suspect that someone counted on the confusion of the morning, the similarity of the containers, and the assumption that each contestant would be responsible for their own entry to disguise their murderous intent." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. "But who would do such a thing? And why use my grandmother's tin? Why involve me at all?" Miss Marple had been pondering these very questions, and she believed she was beginning to understand the full scope of the murderer's plan. It had been a scheme of considerable complexity, designed not only to kill Professor Mordaunt, but to ensure that someone else would be blamed for the crime. The choice of Sarah Mills as the unwitting accomplice had been deliberate and cruel, exploiting both her innocence and her devotion to her grandmother's memory. But the murderer had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the power of careful observation and logical deduction to unravel even the most carefully constructed deception. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Sarah's cottage, she reflected that the case was approaching its climax. The mechanical aspects of the crime were becoming clear, but the human motivations behind it remained to be fully explored. Tomorrow, she decided, it would be time to confront the murderer directly, and bring this tragic affair to its inevitable conclusion. Chapter 6. The Baker's Deadly Recipe. The revelation of the switched tins had provided Miss Marple with the key to understanding how the murder had been accomplished, but the question of motive remained paramount in her mind. As she walked through the village on the morning following her discoveries, she found herself studying the familiar cottages and gardens with new eyes, wondering which of her neighbors harbored the capacity for such calculated malice. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who appeared at her garden gate, looking both frustrated and intrigued. "Miss Marple," he called out, "I wonder if I might have a word. There have been some developments in the case that I think you'll find interesting." Miss Marple invited him in for tea, and as they settled in her sitting room, the inspector consulted his notebook with the air of a man trying to make sense of contradictory evidence. "We've completed our analysis of the contaminated tarts," he began, "and the results are quite remarkable. The ground almonds weren't simply mixed into the filling, they were incorporated with a level of skill that suggests professional baking experience. Whoever prepared these tarts knew exactly what they were doing." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, though she was not entirely surprised by this revelation. "And have you been able to trace the source of the almonds themselves?" Inspector Craddock nodded grimly. "That's where it gets particularly intriguing. The almonds came from a very specific supplier, a specialty food shop in London that caters to high-end restaurants and professional bakers, not the sort of place a typical village resident would shop." Miss Marple felt a small chill of recognition. Margaret Dalton mentioned having worked in London before moving to St. Mary Mead. Did she ever specify what sort of work? "Now that you mention it, we haven't fully investigated her background. She's been rather vague about her previous employment, claimed she was semi-retired and wanted a quieter life." The inspector made a note. "I'll have someone look into her London connections immediately."
After Inspector Craddock left, Miss Marple decided it was time to pay a more thorough visit to Margaret Dalton's cottage. This time, however, she would not announce her arrival in advance. Sometimes, she had learned, the most revealing observations came from catching people in unguarded moments. She approached the cottage through the back garden, where she could observe the kitchen windows without being immediately noticed. What she saw confirmed several of her suspicions. Through the window she could see Margaret Dalton at work in her kitchen, but this was not the amateur baker she had pretended to be. Her movements were precise and professional, her technique that of someone with extensive commercial experience. More telling still were the ingredients arranged on her counter: professional-grade almond flour, imported vanilla, and several other specialty items that would have been expensive and difficult to obtain in a village setting. This was clearly a woman who spared no expense when it came to baking supplies, despite her claims of oven troubles and failed attempts. Miss Marple circled around to the front of the cottage and knocked firmly on the door. When Margaret Dalton answered, Miss Marple was struck by the change in her appearance. Gone was the carefully maintained facade of genteel village life. Instead, she looked haggard and nervous, her clothes less perfectly coordinated and her manner distinctly defensive. "Miss Marple," Margaret said with forced brightness. "What a lovely surprise. I was just tidying up the kitchen." "How fortunate," Miss Marple replied smoothly. "I was hoping we might have a chat about baking techniques. I understand you have considerable professional experience in that area." The effect of this statement was immediate and dramatic. Margaret Dalton's face went white, and her hand trembled as she gripped the door frame. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "I'm just an amateur baker like everyone else." "I think not," Miss Marple said gently but firmly. "I think you're a professional baker who came to St. Mary Mead for reasons that had nothing to do with seeking a quieter life. I think you came here specifically because of Emma Mills and her granddaughter Sarah." Margaret's composure cracked completely at the mention of Emma Mills. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "That woman ruined my life. She destroyed everything I worked for." Miss Marple stepped into the cottage uninvited, her manner still gentle but with an underlying authority that prevented Margaret from objecting. "Why don't you tell me about it, my dear? Sometimes it helps to share the burden." They sat in Margaret's over-decorated sitting room, and slowly, reluctantly, the truth began to emerge. Margaret Dalton had indeed been a professional baker, the owner of a successful London bakery that had catered to wealthy clients and exclusive events. Her reputation had been built on her skill with traditional English pastries and her ability to recreate historical recipes with absolute authenticity. "I was doing well," Margaret explained, her voice bitter with remembered disappointment. "Building a clientele, getting featured in magazines, even being considered for a cookbook deal. Then that cookbook author, the one researching traditional village recipes, came to me with Emma Mills' so-called family secrets." Miss Marple listened with growing understanding as the story unfolded. The cookbook author had presented Emma Mills as the keeper of authentic family recipes passed down through generations, recipes that represented the true heart of English village baking. Margaret had been commissioned to test and refine these recipes for publication, believing she was working with genuine historical formulations. But they weren't family recipes at all, Margaret continued, her voice rising with indignation. They were recipes I had developed myself, techniques I had perfected through years of experimentation and study. Emma Mills had somehow obtained copies of my work and was passing them off as her grandmother's traditional methods. The betrayal had been devastating both professionally and financially. When Margaret attempted to prove that the recipes were her own creation, she found herself facing legal challenges she couldn't afford to fight. Emma Mills, backed by the cookbook publisher's legal team, had successfully portrayed Margaret as a bitter competitor trying to steal credit for traditional family recipes. "I lost my bakery, my reputation, everything," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "Emma Mills became the celebrated keeper of village traditions, while I was branded as a fraud and a thief. I had to sell everything to pay the legal fees, and no respectable establishment would hire me after the scandal." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, understanding now the depth of resentment that had driven Margaret to seek revenge. "And so you came to St. Mary Mead to confront Emma Mills directly." "I arrived just 2 weeks after her funeral," Margaret said bitterly. 2 weeks too late to get the justice I deserved. But Sarah was there carrying on her grandmother's legacy, still using my recipes and claiming they were family traditions. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in Miss Marple's mind. Margaret's plan had been elaborate and multifaceted, designed not only to eliminate Professor Mordaunt, who as a food expert might have recognized the true origins of the recipes, but to destroy Sarah Mills's reputation and secure her own position in the village. "You contaminated your own tarts with ground almonds," Miss Marple said quietly, then switched them with Sarah's tarts using the confusion over the similar tins. "You knew Professor Mordaunt's allergy would be triggered, and you expected Sarah to be blamed for his death." Margaret nodded slowly, seeming almost relieved to have the truth finally acknowledged. "It should have worked perfectly. Sarah would have been arrested, tried and convicted. The Mills family legacy would have been destroyed, just as they destroyed mine, and I would have been free to establish myself as the village's premier baker, using the techniques that were rightfully mine all along." But Miss Marple could see that Margaret's quest for revenge had consumed her completely, transforming a legitimate grievance into a monstrous crime that had cost an innocent man his life and nearly destroyed an equally innocent young woman. As she prepared to call Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple reflected sadly on the tragedy of human nature, how justified anger could fester into deadly hatred, and how the pursuit of revenge could corrupt even the most skilled and talented individuals into instruments of destruction. Chapter 7: Crumbs of Evidence. Inspector Craddock arrived at Margaret Dalton's cottage within minutes of Miss Marple's telephone call, bringing with him Sergeant Lake and the necessary equipment to conduct a thorough search of the premises. Margaret herself sat in stunned silence, her confession having drained her of all resistance, and leaving her with the hollow expression of someone who had finally reached the end of a long and destructive journey. "Mrs. Dalton," Inspector Craddock said formally, "I am arresting you for the murder of Professor Mordaunt and the attempted murder by deception of Sarah Mills. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." As the inspector cautioned her, Miss Marple observed Margaret's face with the mixture of sadness and fascination that she always felt when confronting the depths of human malice. Here was a woman whose considerable talents had been corrupted by bitterness, and whose justified anger had metastasized into something monstrous and ultimately self-destructive. The search of Margaret's cottage yielded a wealth of evidence that confirmed both her professional background and her murderous intent. In her kitchen, they found professional-grade baking equipment that would have cost thousands of pounds, far more than any amateur baker would reasonably possess. Hidden in a locked cabinet were recipe notebooks filled with detailed formulations in Margaret's handwriting, many of which matched exactly the so-called family recipes that Emma Mills had claimed as her ancestral heritage. Most damning of all was a partially completed journal that Margaret had apparently been writing, documenting her grievances against the Mills family and outlining her plans for revenge. The entries revealed a mind consumed by resentment and a carefully calculated plot that had taken months to develop and execute. "Listen to this," Inspector Craddock said, reading from one of the journal entries. "Sarah Mills walks through the village receiving praise for her grandmother's baking, never knowing that every recipe she cherishes was stolen from me. Today I watched her arrange those cinnamon tarts, my cinnamon tarts, with such pride. Soon she will learn what it feels like to have everything taken away." Miss Marple shook her head sadly as she examined the evidence. "Such talent wasted on revenge," she murmured. "If she had channeled her energy into rebuilding rather than destroying, she might have achieved everything she originally wanted." The investigation also revealed the full extent of Margaret's deception in insinuating herself into village life. Her claim to want a quieter existence had been entirely fabricated. She had researched St. Mary Mead thoroughly before moving there, identifying it as Emma Mill's home village and calculating that she could establish herself as a respected member of the community while planning her revenge. Her rental of the cottage had been strategic rather than opportunistic. She had known about Emma Mill's property and had hoped to purchase it as a way of symbolically claiming victory over her enemy. When Sarah inherited the cottage instead, Margaret's resentment had deepened, and her plans had expanded to include the destruction of the younger woman's life as well. She watched Sarah for months, Inspector Craddock observed, consulting the journal entries, learning her routines, her baking schedule, her relationships with other villagers. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign of revenge. The technical aspects of the murder plot revealed Margaret's professional expertise in the most chilling way possible. She had known exactly how to prepare ground almonds so they would be virtually undetectable in cinnamon-based preparations. She had calculated the precise amount needed to trigger a fatal allergic reaction in someone of Professor Mordaunt's size and sensitivity level. Most disturbing of all, she had planned the timing so that the poisoned tarts would be consumed during the public judging, ensuring maximum trauma and confusion. The switch tins were the key to the whole scheme, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Craddock as they stood in Margaret's kitchen. She prepared the poisoned tarts in a tin identical to Sarah's grandmother's, knowing that the morning confusion and similar appearances would create the perfect opportunity for substitution. But how did she gain access to Sarah's cottage to make the switch? The inspector asked. Miss Marple pointed to a set of keys hanging on a hook near Margaret's back door. "I suspect she made copies of Sarah's keys during one of her supposedly friendly visits. It would have been simple enough to slip into the cottage after Sarah went to bed and replace the genuine tarts with her contaminated versions." The psychological profile that emerged from Margaret's journal entries painted a picture of someone whose legitimate grievances had been amplified by isolation and brooding until they became an all-consuming obsession. She had spent years nursing her resentment, researching the Mills family, and planning elaborate scenarios of revenge that grew more extreme with each iteration. She actually considered several different approaches, Inspector Craddock noted, reading through the journal. Poisoning Sarah directly, burning down the cottage, even attempting to frame her for some other crime. The baking contest murder was her most sophisticated plan, designed to destroy Sarah's reputation while eliminating anyone who might recognize the true origins of the recipes. Miss Marple found herself particularly troubled by Margaret's manipulation of village relationships and her exploitation of innocent people like Mrs. Weatherby. The scheme had required Margaret to study the personalities and habits of numerous villagers, identifying their weaknesses and using them as unwitting accomplices in her plot. She knew exactly how Mrs. Weatherby would react to visiting Sarah on the morning of the contest, Miss Marple observed. She counted on her kindness and her nervousness, leading to the tin confusion that made the substitution possible. As the day wore on and more evidence was catalogued, the full scope of Margaret's deception became apparent. She had created an entirely false identity and history, presenting herself as a recently retired woman seeking peaceful village life, while actually being an embittered professional whose career had been destroyed by legal battles and public scandal. Her financial resources had been considerable, far more than she had claimed, allowing her to purchase expensive equipment and ingredients while maintaining the pretense of being an amateur baker with simple needs.
The contrast between her public persona and her private reality was so extreme that Miss Marple wondered how she had managed to sustain the deception for so long. Perhaps, Miss Marple reflected, the most tragic aspect of this case is that Margaret Dalton's original grievance may well have been legitimate, but in seeking revenge rather than justice, she became something far worse than those who had wronged her. As Margaret was led away to begin what would undoubtedly be a lengthy prison sentence, Miss Marple could not help but feel a deep sadness for all the lives that had been damaged by this affair. Professor Mordaunt was dead, Sarah Mills would carry the trauma of nearly being convicted for murder, and Margaret herself had destroyed any possibility of rebuilding the career and reputation she had once enjoyed. The village would recover, as villages always did, but the scars would remain for a long time. And somewhere in London, there were recipe books still being sold that bore Emma Mills's name on techniques that had actually been developed by the woman who was now being driven away in a police car, her talent forever overshadowed by her crimes. Chapter 8. The Bitter Aftertaste. The arrest of Margaret Dalton sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead that took weeks to fully subside. The revelation that a trusted neighbor had been living among them under false pretenses, planning murder with methodical precision, challenged the village's fundamental sense of security and trust. Miss Marple found herself fielding numerous visits from concerned residents, all seeking reassurance that such deception could not happen again. Sarah Mills, cleared of all suspicion but deeply traumatized by her experience, struggled to return to normal life. Miss Marple paid her several visits during the difficult period following Margaret's arrest, offering both practical support and the gentle wisdom that came from decades of observing human nature in all its complexity. "I keep thinking about grandmother's recipes," Sarah confided during one of these visits, her voice still shaky with emotion. "Were they really stolen from that woman? Should I stop using them? It feels like everything I thought I knew about my family has been contaminated." Miss Marple considered this question carefully, understanding that it went to the heart of Sarah's identity and her connection to her beloved grandmother. "My dear," she said finally, "the techniques may have originated elsewhere, but your grandmother's love and care in using them were entirely genuine. She made those recipes her own through years of practice and refinement, and she shared them with you as an expression of her affection." She paused, watching as Sarah absorbed this perspective. "Besides, I suspect that if we traced any recipe back far enough, we would find that it built upon countless earlier versions and techniques. Cooking, like most human endeavors, is a collaborative art that spans generations and cultures." This conversation led Miss Marple to reflect on the broader implications of the case. Margaret Dalton's obsession with ownership and originality had blinded her to the collaborative nature of culinary tradition. In her quest to reclaim what she saw as her intellectual property, she had lost sight of the joy and community that baking was supposed to create. Inspector Craddock's investigation into Margaret's background revealed the full extent of her deception and the tragic waste of her considerable talents. She had indeed been a skilled professional baker, whose London establishment had achieved considerable success before the legal battles with Emma Mills's publishers destroyed her reputation and livelihood. The irony, Inspector Craddock explained to Miss Marple during one of their post-case discussions, is that she probably would have won the baking contest legitimately. Her technical skills were superior to anyone else in the village, including Sarah Mills. If she had simply entered the competition honestly, she would have achieved the recognition she craved without resorting to murder. But Miss Marple understood that for Margaret, honest competition would not have provided the psychological satisfaction she sought. Her need for revenge had become more important than any practical goal, consuming her rationality and ultimately leading to her destruction. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and complex, complicated by Margaret's attempts to justify her actions and her lawyer's efforts to present her as a victim of intellectual property theft rather than a cold-blooded murderer. The prosecution had little difficulty establishing her guilt, the physical evidence was overwhelming, and her own journal provided a detailed confession, but the sentencing phase required careful consideration of her motivations and mental state. Dr. Haydock, called upon to provide expert testimony about Professor Mordaunt's death, was particularly scathing in his assessment of Margaret's actions. "This was not a crime of passion or temporary insanity," he testified. The defendant's journal entries show months of careful planning, detailed knowledge of the victim's medical condition, and callous disregard for the suffering she would cause to innocent people. The judge ultimately sentenced Margaret to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years, noting that her crimes had shown exceptional premeditation and had terrorized an entire community. The sentence brought closure to the legal proceedings, but did little to heal the emotional wounds that her actions had created. Mrs. Weatherby, who had been inadvertently instrumental in the success of Margaret's plan, struggled with feelings of guilt and responsibility that no amount of rational explanation could entirely dispel. "If I hadn't visited Sarah that morning," she repeatedly told Miss Marple, "if I hadn't confused the tins, Professor Mordaunt might still be alive." Miss Marple's response was characteristically gentle but firm. "My dear Eleanor, you acted with nothing but kindness and good intentions. The responsibility for this tragedy lies entirely with the person who planned and executed it. You were as much a victim of Margaret Dalton's manipulation as anyone else." The baking contest itself became a casualty of the scandal, with Mrs. Harrington announcing that it would be suspended indefinitely while the community recovered from the trauma. This decision was met with mixed reactions. Some felt that continuing the tradition would help the village heal, while others believed that the contest had been forever tainted by its association with murder. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the delicate balance between tradition and change that every community must navigate. The contest had been a source of innocent pleasure and friendly competition for 15 years, but its association with Margaret Dalton's crimes had transformed it into something darker and more complex. Perhaps, she suggested to Mrs. Harrington, the contest could be resumed next year with some modifications, different judges, different format, maybe even a different focus. The goal would be to preserve the community aspect while creating new associations that aren't overshadowed by this tragedy. The suggestion was well received, and by the following autumn, St. Mary Mead had indeed resumed its baking tradition, though with safeguards and changes that reflected the lessons learned from the previous year's disaster. Professor Mordaunt was commemorated with a special memorial prize for innovation in traditional recipes, and Sarah Mills, after much consideration, decided to participate again, using techniques that honored both her grandmother's memory and the broader culinary heritage they represented. Margaret Dalton's cottage was eventually sold to a young family from London, who renovated it extensively and removed all traces of its previous occupants' elaborate deceptions. The professional baking equipment was donated to a culinary school, where it could be put to constructive use rather than serving as a reminder of talents corrupted by hatred. As Miss Marple walked past the cottage one evening, observing the warm light spilling from its windows and hearing the laughter of children playing in the garden, she reflected on the resilience of communities and the healing power of time. Evil had touched this place, but it had not conquered it. Life had returned, bringing with it the possibility of new beginnings and better choices. The case had taught her once again that the greatest tragedies often arose not from simple malice but from the corruption of legitimate grievances and justified anger. Margaret Dalton's original complaint about stolen recipes might well have been valid, but her choice to pursue vengeance rather than justice had transformed her from a victim into a perpetrator, destroying any moral authority she might have claimed. It was a lesson that Miss Marple carried with her as she continued her quiet observations of village life, always alert to the signs that suggested when hurt feelings might be hardening into something more dangerous, and ready to offer the gentle intervention that might prevent another tragedy from unfolding. Chapter 9. The Recipe for Justice. 6 months after Margaret Dalton's conviction, St. Mary Mead had largely returned to its customary rhythm of gentle gossip, seasonal celebrations, and the thousand small dramas that make up village life. Yet Miss Marple noticed that certain changes had taken root in the community, subtle shifts in behavior and attitude that reflected the lasting impact of the murder case. People were more cautious about accepting newcomers at face value, more attentive to the stories that neighbors told about their backgrounds and motivations. This wariness was not entirely unwelcome. A degree of healthy skepticism could protect the community from future deceptions, but Miss Marple also observed with concern that some villagers had become overly suspicious, treating innocent eccentricities as potential signs of criminal intent. Sarah Mills had perhaps changed most of all. The young woman who had once approached baking with the uncomplicated joy of someone carrying on a beloved family tradition now brought a more complex understanding to her craft. She had begun researching the history of her grandmother's recipes, not to challenge their authenticity but to understand their place in the broader tapestry of culinary development. I've discovered that 3 of grandmother's most treasured recipes appear in cookbooks dating back to the 18th century, Sarah told Miss Marple during one of their regular conversations, but each version is slightly different, adapted to local tastes and available ingredients. I think that's how cooking really works. It's an ongoing conversation between past and present, not a collection of sacred texts that can never be changed. This mature perspective had earned Sarah considerable respect in the village, where her thoughtful approach to tradition and innovation was seen as a model for how communities might honor their heritage while remaining open to growth and change. She had been asked to teach baking classes at the village hall, sharing not only techniques but also the stories and histories that gave meaning to the food they prepared together. Miss Marple was particularly pleased to see that Sarah had developed a friendship with young Mrs. Peterson, the new occupant of Margaret Dalton's former cottage. The 2 women, similar in age and interests, had bonded over their shared love of gardening and baking, creating the kind of natural community connection that no amount of scheming could artificially produce. It's wonderful to see the cottage filled with genuine happiness again, Mrs. Peterson confided to Miss Marple one afternoon as they watched Sarah teaching her young daughter to make scones. When we first moved in, the neighbors warned us about the terrible things that had happened there, but I think love and laughter are the best way to cleanse a place of old sorrows. The legal aftermath of Margaret's case had continued for months, with appeals and counter-appeals that generated considerable paperwork, but little change in her situation. Her lawyers had attempted to argue that her actions constituted a form of vigilante justice rather than premeditated murder, but the courts remained unmoved by such reasoning. More interesting to Miss Marple was the investigation that had emerged into the original dispute between Margaret and Emma Mills. A journalist researching the case had discovered that the situation had been far more complex than either party had publicly acknowledged, with elements of legitimate grievance on both sides, and significant misconduct by the publishing company that had profited from the controversy. It appears, Inspector Craddock explained during one of his visits to Miss Marple's cottage, that Emma Mills did indeed use some of Margaret Dalton's techniques without proper attribution, but Margaret had also borrowed elements from traditional recipes without acknowledgement. The publisher encouraged both women to exaggerate their claims of originality because controversy sold books. This revelation cast the entire tragedy in an even more poignant light. 2 talented bakers had been manipulated into a destructive conflict by commercial interests that cared nothing for their actual welfare or the integrity of their craft. Margaret's quest for revenge had been built on a foundation of legitimate anger mixed with manufactured outrage, creating a volatile combination that had ultimately exploded into murder. If only they had been able to talk to each other directly, Miss Marple reflected. If they had recognized their common interests rather than focusing on their competitive differences, they might have found a way to collaborate rather than destroy each other. The broader culinary community had taken notice of the case, with several food writers and cookbook authors using it as an opportunity to discuss the ethics of recipe attribution and the collaborative nature of traditional cooking. Some good had emerged from the tragedy in the form of new guidelines for food publishers and increased awareness of the importance of crediting sources appropriately. Sarah Mills had been invited to contribute to these discussions, sharing her perspective as someone who had inherited disputed recipes and had to navigate the complex emotions surrounding their use. Her thoughtful approach to the ethical questions involved had made her something of a spokesperson for the next generation of traditional bakers. I think the most important thing Sarah had written in a letter to a food magazine is to approach cooking with humility and gratitude. Every recipe we use builds on the work of countless people who came before us. Our job is not to claim ownership but to carry the tradition forward with respect and creativity. Miss Marple found herself thinking often about the nature of legacy and inheritance, not just in cooking but in all aspects of human endeavor. Margaret Dalton had possessed genuine talent and legitimate grievances, but her inability to move beyond her anger had ultimately destroyed everything she had hoped to protect or reclaim. Emma Mills, too, had made questionable choices in her eagerness to preserve what she saw as family traditions, perhaps cutting corners on attribution and allowing commercial interests to override ethical considerations. Yet her love for her granddaughter and her genuine commitment to sharing the joy of baking had created something positive that survived even the revelation of her flawed methods. The contrast between the two women's legacies was stark and instructive. Margaret's superior technical skills and legitimate grievances had been overshadowed by her choice to pursue revenge, leaving behind only destruction and cautionary tales. Emma's imperfect knowledge and questionable practices had nonetheless produced love, community, and the foundation for continued growth and learning.
Miss Marple had observed this pattern many times in her long life. The way that good intentions imperfectly executed often yielded better results than perfect techniques corrupted by malice. It was a lesson that applied far beyond the realm of baking, touching on fundamental questions about human nature and the choices that shaped individual destinies. The village's healing process had been aided by several deliberate acts of commemoration and reconciliation. A memorial garden had been planted in Professor Mordaunt's honor, featuring herbs and edible flowers that local bakers could use in their creations. The garden served as both a tribute to the murdered judge and a symbol of the community's commitment to transforming tragedy into something constructive. Mrs. Harrington had organized a series of cooking classes that brought together bakers of all skill levels, from complete beginners to accomplished practitioners like Sarah Mills. The classes emphasized collaboration over competition, with participants sharing techniques and stories rather than competing for prizes or recognition. I think Mrs. Harrington explained to Miss Marple that we need to rediscover the social aspect of baking, the way it brings people together rather than dividing them. Competition has its place, but it shouldn't overshadow the fundamental purpose of food, which is to nourish and unite us. These classes had proven remarkably popular, drawing participants from neighboring villages and even attracting visitors from London who were seeking authentic experiences of rural life. The success of the program had generated income for village projects and had helped to restore St. Mary Mead's reputation as a welcoming and vibrant community. Miss Marple often attended these gatherings not as a participant; her baking skills were adequate but unremarkable, but as an observer of the social dynamics that emerged when people shared knowledge and worked toward common goals. She was pleased to see how naturally the group had developed its own traditions and rituals, creating new forms of community engagement that honored the past while embracing the future. The most touching aspect of these gatherings was the way they had provided a space for processing the trauma of Margaret's crimes. Participants gradually began sharing their own experiences of the case, their shock at the revelations, their struggles with broken trust, their efforts to understand how such deception had been possible in their midst. "It's been therapeutic, Dr. Haydock observed to Miss Marple after attending one of the sessions. People need to talk through these experiences to make sense of them in a supportive environment. The baking provides a comfortable structure for difficult conversations." Sarah Mills had emerged as a natural leader in these discussions, her personal experience of being falsely accused giving her unique credibility and insight. She had learned to speak openly about her fears during the investigation, her gratitude for those who had supported her, and her ongoing efforts to rebuild her sense of security and trust. I realized, Sarah told the group during one particularly moving session, that I had been carrying around a lot of anger about what happened to me, but holding on to that anger was only hurting me further. I had to find a way to let it go, not for Margaret's sake but for my own. This wisdom had resonated throughout the community, helping others to process their own reactions to the case and to consider how they might move forward constructively. Miss Marple observed with satisfaction that the village was not only recovering from its trauma but was actually becoming stronger and more cohesive as a result of the challenges it had faced. The seasonal cycle had provided its own form of healing, with the arrival of spring bringing renewed energy and optimism to St. Mary Mead. Gardens that had been neglected during the dark months following the murder were once again flourishing, and the usual round of fêtes, festivals and social gatherings had resumed with perhaps even greater enthusiasm than before. Miss Marple, walking through the village on a particularly lovely morning in May, reflected on the resilience of communities and the remarkable human capacity for renewal. Margaret Dalton's crimes had been real and devastating, but they had not succeeded in their ultimate goal of destroying the bonds that held the village together. Instead, those bonds had been tested and strengthened, creating a foundation for future growth that was more solid and self-aware than what had existed before. The village had learned important lessons about vigilance and discernment without losing its essential character of warmth and openness. As she paused to admire Mrs. Peterson's garden, where roses planted by the cottage's new occupants were beginning to bloom alongside herbs that Sarah Mills had contributed, Miss Marple smiled with quiet satisfaction. Life, like the best recipes, had a way of combining disparate elements into something greater than the sum of its parts. Even tragedy, properly processed and understood, could contribute to a richer and more meaningful whole. Chapter 10: The Final Ingredient. A year after the tragic events that had shaken St. Mary Mead to its foundations, the village prepared for what many hoped would be a healing celebration, the first annual Professor Mordaunt Memorial Baking Festival. Unlike the competitive atmosphere that had characterized the previous contest, this new event was designed as a community celebration of culinary traditions and the bonds that food creates between neighbors and friends. Miss Marple, now in her 82nd year, had been asked to serve as the festival's honorary patron, a role that primarily involved offering gentle guidance and observing the preparations with her characteristic blend of wisdom and curiosity. She had accepted the position with pleasure, seeing it as an opportunity to witness the village's continued healing and growth. The festival preparations had brought together virtually every household in St. Mary Mead, with residents contributing not only baked goods but also stories, recipes, and memories that illustrated the role of food in their family histories and community life. Sarah Mills had organized a particularly moving display featuring recipes from various village families, each accompanied by photographs and narratives that traced their origins and evolution over generations. "What strikes me most," Sarah explained to Miss Marple as they reviewed the display, "is how these recipes tell the story of our community, the way they've been adapted to local ingredients, modified for different occasions, shared between neighbors during times of celebration and sorrow. They're living documents of who we are as a people." The display included, with appropriate acknowledgement and context, several of the recipes that had been at the center of the previous year's tragedy. Sarah had researched their histories thoroughly, tracing their development through multiple sources and acknowledging both Emma Mills's contributions and the earlier work that had informed them. "I wanted to show how recipes really evolve," Sarah continued, "not as the property of any individual but as part of a continuing conversation between cooks across time and place. Grandmother's versions were valid expressions of these traditions, even if they weren't entirely original creations." Miss Marple was particularly impressed by the maturity and wisdom that Sarah had developed through her ordeal. The young woman had transformed her traumatic experience into an opportunity for deeper understanding, both of her own family history and of the broader patterns of cultural transmission that shaped all human communities. The festival itself dawned bright and clear, with perfect weather that seemed to bless the community's efforts at renewal and reconciliation. Tables had been arranged throughout the village green, creating an informal marketplace where residents could sample various offerings while engaging in the sort of relaxed conversation that builds and strengthens social bonds. Mrs. Harrington, looking considerably more relaxed than she had during the preparations for the previous year's fateful contest, moved through the crowd with evident satisfaction at how successfully the event was proceeding. "I think Professor Mordaunt would have approved," she told Miss Marple as they paused near the memorial garden. "He always said that food should bring people together, not drive them apart." The memorial garden itself had become a focal point of the festival, with visitors leaving small tokens of remembrance and gratitude among the herbs and flowers that grew there. Miss Marple was touched to see that someone had left a copy of one of Professor Mordaunt's favorite poetry books, open to a verse about the simple pleasures of shared meals and friendly conversation. Inspector Craddock had returned for the festival, bringing with him news of Margaret Dalton's situation in prison. The former baker had apparently adapted poorly to incarceration, struggling with the loss of freedom and the inability to pursue her craft. Her requests for permission to work in the prison kitchen had been denied due to security concerns, leaving her with little outlet for the skills that had once defined her identity. She's had several opportunities for psychiatric counseling, Inspector Craddock reported to Miss Marple, but she continues to insist that her actions were justified, that she was the victim of a conspiracy that destroyed her legitimate career. The doctors say she may never accept responsibility for what she did. Miss Marple sighed sadly at this news, recognizing that Margaret's inability to move beyond her grievances had ultimately imprisoned her in ways that went far beyond her physical confinement. The contrast with Sarah Mills's growth and healing could not have been more stark, illustrating the different paths that individuals could choose when faced with injustice and disappointment. As the day progressed, Miss Marple found herself engaged in numerous conversations with visitors who had heard about the previous year's events and were curious about how the community had recovered. She was struck by how naturally residents had learned to discuss the tragedy, acknowledging its impact while focusing on the positive changes it had ultimately brought about. "We learned that we needed to be more careful about who we trust," one elderly gentleman explained to a group of visitors, "but we also learned that running away from each other isn't the answer. The best protection against deception is building stronger, more honest relationships with our neighbors." This wisdom had practical applications that extended throughout village life. The church had begun offering discussion groups focused on conflict resolution and community building.